One of the things that you shared in the book was about PE's dominance. I totally agree with this. PE's dominance and influence, it has changed really how the new franchise or startup is, in that even the deck is stacked against the bootstrap founder. But I do want to point out it can be done. And if you're doing the right things, do not fear the competition that you're going to encounter, that you can still win.
Yeah.
But whether you are involved with private equity or not, you are involved with private equity because your competition may be. But it's not a reason to go saying, I need a PE partner, right?
Correct. Yeah. It's just the reality of what, especially, in some of the more crowded sectors. If you're launching a home services brand today,
Mm-hmm.
you're launching into a crowded sector with at least 20 platforms already established, focused on home services. Try to build a brand momentum in a market when, like, let's say you're a mosquito services brand. Okay, well, there's already 20 or 30 of those to begin with. Plus, every one of the platforms has one of those. So how are you going to compete from a local marketing perspective? How are you going to get customers to compete against all the stuff going on in your market? You've just got to think it through. The game has changed. It is what it is. It means you need to be better capitalized.
Mm-hmm.
It means you need to be more thoughtful about your marketing approach, how your unit level operations and how franchisees can achieve profitability. And for many brands, it means, this model that we've had recently where people have one corporate unit or no corporate units and then start selling franchises. I just don't know that that's very sustainable. You've got to have at least a few corporate units because you need the cash flow. It's going to take you longer to get this thing up and going than you think it's going to.
I
If you've got the corporate units, then you've got some extra cash flow to fund the support that you need and to really make sure the market is well done, or the operating model is well done before you go to market.
I agree with you completely on that. I always tell people, do as I say, not as I did, because I lived a very stressful life of trying to keep the lights on by selling franchises, because I had one company on location and I inevitably sold it to fund my business to franchise. And the first franchise I sold was right in my backyard, as it turned out. So, it was all the things. Don't do what I did. But I agree with you. Considering opening a couple more corporate units to determine the viability and just having that cash flow so you don't feel that unnecessary pressure. Another great point you made is that, PE's involvement in franchising, what it does is it sets up weaker concepts to fail faster. And I do love that. And I do think there needs to be a cleansing. Just as we went through this during the Great Recession. I remember when we were at the IFA events and actually the Franchise Development and Leadership Conference in October of 2008, when all hell broke loose economically. And I remember hearing, there was sort of a, the sky is falling. But the other thing we were also talking about were there were quite a bit of number of concepts that shouldn't have existed. They were a mediocre business that survived because the economy was good prior, and now they weren't going to last. And this is like a different version of that, Alicia. This influence is now going to make weak concepts fail quicker, which that is a upside to this, to the consumer and to potential franchisees that are looking at franchises.
Yeah, they're just those little concepts just won't be as likely to break. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but they're not going to be as likely to break out because it's hard to get traction with potential franchisees in particular. So to me, that's a good outcome. We don't want any franchisees to, franchisee signing on to an emerging brand is already kind of a maverick and a risk taker to begin with. But, to me, waiting until that brand has more units open, especially if they're corporate units, is just a better way to go.
Yeah. So Alicia, let's talk about the profit ladder in franchising, specifically these rungs on the ladder that you've identified in franchising that I came to experience firsthand as well. Why don't you share with the audience what that's all about?
Sure. Well, it just acknowledges that brands go through different cycles and PE firms themselves tend to specialize. The trend is not toward generalists. Now, the trend in private equity is to really specialize and to deeply understand a sector to be more effective in that sector. And in franchising, that bifurcates down into emerging different verticals in some cases. So like food, not food is a common sort of inflection point that people have to decide. But the firms organize themselves along this ladder, and some will only, continue to play in the emerging space and They might ride it up for a little while, but really that's their sweet spot and where they're most effective. That's where they're going to play. There's others like Rourke Capital that your business ultimately sold to, where they prefer much larger scale brands and they'll do a long hold and continue to nurture that brand and grow it over time. So you can kind of clearly see where private equity firms are going to land on this thing. And the other thing that people don't maybe understand is once it's gone to its first private equity deal, it's going to keep retrading over time on a fairly predictable cadence. That's just what happens. Mm-hmm. So for franchisees, it's something to pay attention to, right? If you're already private equity backed, you're likely to stay that way for quite a long time, but the ownership may change.
Mm-hmm. And this is why I say, said right from the beginning of our show, why this book is so important for not just franchisors to read, but for franchisees, because if you are a prospective franchisee looking at a brand, you want to know where this franchisor is on the ladder. Are they not even in private equity? What's the founder or what's ownership's view on getting involved in private equity? If they're on that first rung on the ladder, let's talk about some of the characteristics. I went through the first rung on the ladder where I wanted to take some chips off the table. I was the founder that still loved my company. I wanted to be involved, and I networked, I think, properly with PEs that were looking for the first rung on the ladder, right? They were folks that wanted me and my team to still be heavily involved. And I found great partners that basically said, you guys know exactly what you're doing. Here's the money. We know we're going to get a great return on it. Just keep doing what you're doing. And the managing partner from the private equity that I worked with years ago, he came out so far to say that, geez, he goes, Frank, if I had 20 of you guys, I would just be sipping Mai Tais on the beach all day. There is nothing for me to do with your company. You guys know exactly what you need to do. Now, that was a far different experience than the next rung on the calendar when LNC Capital decided to sell to Rourke, and they have a different view on things, right? So why don't you share then what that next rung usually looks like when private equity sells to private equity?
Okay, so that sponsor to sponsor transfer is where there can be a lot of change. In that first deal, the founder, has say over who that partner is and what that partnership is structured like. And are you aligned on your goals together? And, do you feel like you could work with this firm? Hopefully, founders do a good job of vetting the partner, that first partner. It doesn't always happen, unfortunately, but hopefully they do. But in the second transaction, you've already sold majority control of your business. Now someone else is making the decision about who buys it and when and what they're going to do with it going forward. That's when the culture really can change quite a lot. And it can be jarring, especially for franchisees who came in under the old model and really maybe were even sort of emotionally attached to that founding team and that founder. 10 years later, it now belongs to a larger private equity firm, and it feels really different as a business compared to what they signed up for. And unfortunately, that means in some cases, franchisees might need to move on and do something different because the business is going in a different direction now. So it's something to be aware of. Your 10-year license agreement, 10 years is a long time, especially in an environment where firms are retrading their holdings every 4, 5, 6, 7 years, right? That's shorter. So you may be going through 2 or more private equity owners during your time as a franchisee. If well managed, the business can continue to grow like gangbusters. In the book, I used the example of Tropical Smoothie Cafe, which has been through a series of private equity owners and has continued to flourish and grow in an amazing way. And now they're talking about potentially doing an IPO because it's been so successful. But, you've got to check the track record and talk to franchisees who have been in the system. And, what is it like under this particular private equity sponsor? Is it an effective relationship? Do they listen to franchisees? Do they have a good management team in there? I mean, that's their number one job, is putting a great management team in place if they're not going to back the existing management team. So is that management team effective? You got to ask a lot of questions.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fumey, or Emerging Franchise Group, LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its hosts do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.